I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speakers, Melanie Dupuis from the Dyson College of Arts and Sciences and Jonathan Brown from the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law at Pace University. And if you would both like to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about what you've each been working on around this topic of the pandemic and food security since the pandemic hit.
Sure. Thanks so much, Michelle. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is John Brown, and as Michelle mentioned, I teach at the law school, and I see a couple of familiar names and faces, so great to see some familiar people here. My main function at the law school, I run a clinic called the Food and Beverage Law Clinic. And so as with the other clinics at the law school, it's an opportunity for law students to actually do real legal work on behalf of actual clients. In our case, all the work our clinic does is for small food businesses, small farms, small beverage businesses, and nonprofits and social enterprises that are in the food and agriculture space. So the kind of work we do spans a lot of areas of what I'd call transactional legal work. We help people form businesses. We help people negotiate contracts, negotiate leases, access land, in some cases advise on regulatory issues for food businesses, which could include labeling or food safety, and a host of other things. So in the last few months, we've been continuing to do the work that we've always done, and we're doing that remotely, but also we've tried to pivot as much as we can and give as much support as we possibly can to farms and food businesses that have been affected directly or indirectly by the pandemic. So the kinds of work we've been doing in this area, we've been helping businesses trying to access sources of federal funding. Many of you have probably heard of the SBA programs, Paycheck Protection Program and EIDL program. And so we have tried to walk farmers through those programs. There's actually surprisingly a lot of challenges and a lot of differences in how these programs apply to farms and small farm business, small family-owned farm businesses in particular. So we've created some resources to guide farmers on that and actually work one-on-one with businesses on accessing those funds as well. We've tried to do some work with businesses on kind of acute, immediate emergency situations arising out of the pandemic in terms of needing to renegotiate a lease or other contract or deal with some immediate labor issues. And then maybe the most exciting and encouraging work that we're trying to do is work with businesses, whether they're old businesses that are pivoting to a new model or brand new businesses or nonprofits that are trying to do something to address problems like connect people to food in a way that they haven't done before, provide resources that connect small farms in New York that are looking for markets with customers that are looking for sources of local health, fresh food. So we've been helping organizations either pivot the models that they already have to open up to new markets or help new organizations that are creating new models themselves. So I'm still learning, this is all happening very fast. It seems like it's been a lifetime, but it's only been a couple months. So, still learning what all the dynamics are here, and the dynamics are constantly shifting, but really excited to get a chance to chat with all of you today about all of this.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm Melanie Dupuis, and I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental Studies and Science at Pace. I'm the founding chair of this. It's a new department, which is on both campuses. My work is more on research and teaching on the food system and food policy, and also looking at research on the rise of alternative and sustainable economies. My first book, almost 2 decades ago now, my first book was on the history of milk and its relationship to, in particular, to American political culture. And since then, I've co-authored another book, which is specifically on alternative food networks, and a more recent book on the politics of American dietary advice. And because of all this, as the food system started to deteriorate during the pandemic, it became very interesting. I became very interested, and I wrote an article with a couple of co-authors looking at why are the meat and milk supply chains falling apart with the pandemic, which was published in the Conversation in April. So that's what I've been doing, and I'm continuing to look at how have these industries both have had challenges, but also how are they pivoting towards new ways of doing things.
Great, thank you both. So to get the ball rolling here, can we talk a little bit about what's going on with the supply right now? What are the chances that meat or milk disappear from the shelves again? And how have we ended up in a situation where we have empty grocery shelves, but we also have farmers dumping milk in March?
And Mikhail, I just want to start by thanking you for putting this together, because these are very interesting questions, and I think that it's great that you've brought us together to sort of talk about this.
My pleasure. Thank you for doing it.
And so this is really the question that we addressed in our article in the conversation in April. And my co-authors and I basically put together all the information that seemed to be coming in from both the dairy and the meat sector. And what we were finding was that in some ways, dairy and meat is a little bit like toilet paper. If you started to see why, people were very interested in, like, why is there no toilet paper at the grocery store? And the answer, it turns out, is that there are really at least two different supply chains, right? There's one for commercial that make those great big rolls that don't fit on your toilet paper roll. And then there are those are for commercial and institutional customers. And then there are the ones for grocery stores that you buy at the grocery store. And you can't just pivot from one to the other. The supply chains are totally different. Processing is totally different. The businesses involved are totally different, and so on. But it's not entirely the same, okay? Because cows are not trees. You can leave a tree in the ground, but a cow has to be milked every day. So that's, so this is an important thing about the milk sector. Jonathan's going to talk a little bit more about the meat story, but animals, that you can't just leave them sitting around. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of stories about animals that have been euthanized during this time period. But the thing about milk is that cows have to, milk doesn't last very long. You have to milk a cow every day. You can make milk into these more preserved products like cheese, but as it turned out, when we were looking at these supply chains, there's only so much processing capacity out there, and much of it is far away from, it's just too far to ship the milk to those processors, and then cheese goes into cold storage. There's only so much cold storage capacity, and so as restaurants stopped ordering, there was a backup in terms of the sort of manufactured products that were in cold storage. And one thing that we did find is that pizza delivery the pizza delivery folks are pretty busy, but and pizza cheese is one of those things that milk goes into when it doesn't go into fluid milk into a gallon in a grocery store. But even that industry couldn't make up its restaurant business with delivery orders. So that's what we were finding was happening, and that's what we wrote about. And we wrote about meat as well, but Jonathan's going to tell you a little bit more about the meat sector.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, so the meat story, which is a complicated one, I hope I can speak to it a little bit. I think part of it is similar to what Melanie talked about in terms of different supply chains for food that's typically consumed by consumers shopping at grocery stores versus supply chains to institutional customers and to restaurants. So when you buy meat at a supermarket, it's often a very small package, perhaps a small package of ground beef. That's very typical of a supermarket, right? You're typically not buying unusual cuts of meat. You're typically not buying like larger pieces of a carcass. And that's very different often than what's actually sold to restaurants or what's sold to institutional buyers like schools, hospitals, et cetera. So partly, there's this disruption that happened in so many aspects of the food chain of, okay, well, it's not that people are still eating and there's still meat out there, but like this is all being done in a different way. People are accessing food in a different way, and it's hard to quickly, efficiently pivot to that. So that's part of it. But another part of it is something that's actually been very highly publicized, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it, closures in meatpacking plants and ongoing issues in meatpacking plants and implications from that. So we talk about meatpacking plants, really talking about processing. We're not talking about people that grow livestock. We're not talking about the retail stores. We're talking about in between plants that are responsible for slaughtering livestock, processing, cutting down carcasses, packaging it, et cetera. So that industry is very, very highly concentrated. People talk about a big four. So for beef, there's a big four of Tyson, Cargill, JBS, National Beef. You talk about pork, it's similar. You also have Smithfield. So for beef, for example, these are 4 companies that control over 80% of the market for meat packing. And they operate on a system of, basically cheap labor, very fast production lines. If any of you have seen video or images of this, it just, conveyor belt production lines with people packed shoulder to shoulder. So a couple things with that. One, I mean, these are were already, frankly, pretty horrific working conditions, and just kind of a natural incubator for COVID. And so many of you probably heard of many outbreaks that started being publicized in March and got worse in April, and in April led to some plant closures and are really still going on. So when we had some plant closures of some of these larger manufacturing facilities or processing facilities, that led to kind of bottleneck. It's not that the farmers raising livestock, it's not that there's a shortage there. There's plenty of that. It's a question of who is processing it. And when there are some closures, that led to even higher prices on the retail side for meat, and somewhat of a backlog. Now, as you probably heard as well, there's a lot of pressure to keep these meatpacking plants open. The Trump administration very publicly put a lot of pressure on them to stay open, and that's a whole other issue we can get into. But even after they open up again, there have been some adjustments for distancing. I mean, it's really not very much. We can talk about that when we talk about the working conditions. But the combination of some closures versus some shift in how things are done at these processing plants means that there's some slowdown. So what that's resulted in is a huge backlog in terms of the farmers producing livestock, and actually the prices being paid to farmers have gone down a lot. So you would think that if we're paying a lot for meat at the supermarket, that must be passed on to the processors, that must be passed on to producers. That's actually not the case. Like, the processors are there in the middle, and on the one hand, they're getting historically high prices from consumers, from retail stores that are buying from the processors. And the other hand, they're paying kind of historically low prices to the farmers producing the product, because there's this backlog, and now people have too many animals. And then you hear really sad stories of farmers having to euthanize a lot of the animals because there's just no possibility for getting them processed in time. So again, it's highly concentrated. That's part of the problem, which we'll talk about more. Why isn't the solution to have processing done at smaller processing plants? We'll talk about that more as well, but there are real challenges to that. There are smaller processing plants. There's a huge demand for them, but frankly, like the demand is overwhelming what they can do right now without more shifts and how we support that infrastructure. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Melanie.
And then, one of the things that's interesting about, if you opened up a slaughterhouse, you'd see lots and lots of people wielding knives, and because slaughterhouses are very labor intensive. Dairy, whether you're doing milk, processing milk, or if you opened up a processing plant for dairy, for cheese, what you would see is lots of pipes and not a lot of people. So the basic fact is that people, that having lots of people close together, as we've found more and more, is what creates pandemics. And so we don't have the same issue about, and there has been some COVID cases in cheese plants, but for the most part, that has not been the issue with milk, the same way it has been with the meat plants. And so there's so in each of these cases, the adjustment to the new reality is a little bit different.
So from what you both just said, that kind of explains, does that explain why milk has managed to pivot while meat has not, as we adjust our home, eating more at home and grocery shopping changes? What you just said, is that kind of why how milk has managed to fare better, I guess?
Yeah, well, that's if you look right now, you'll see, well, there is, the good news is that there's milk in the grocery store. The prices have not gone that much higher. And it's also been good for farmers, because dairy prices are rising for farmers, because what was happening is that farmers just did not have access to any kind of livable prices for their milk because they could not sell it basically, and so they had to spill a lot of their milk as well. In fact, at a certain point they were asked to basically get rid of about 10% of their production. But milk has actually managed to do a better job of pivoting to this new reality because of what I was talking about, where so part of the issue is that we don't have the same labor issues in terms of the sort of labor intensity for milk. But as you know, so what's going on with milk? Well, the government, it turns now the government is buying lots of cheese, which is freeing up the space, which is sort of freeing up the supply chain. I don't know if anyone saw this, but one of the first things that disappeared from grocery shelves was Oatly oat milk. You couldn't find Oatly oat milk anywhere. And so, people were thinking, oh, well, everybody's going to just buy a lot of plant milk during this time period. And as it turns out, I've been looking at the sort of dairy statistics, the recent dairy statistics, and it turns out that now that consumers are home, they're buying a whole lot more cow's milk. So prices are rising for dairy farmers. And in fact, they're now even talking about the possibility, and cheese and butter prices are going up. So there may even be a bit of a shortage in terms of those sort of large scale manufactured cheeses, pizza cheese and things like that, which probably won't change the price of your pizza. But it does seem but it seems like those fluid milk companies that serve, that were serving mostly schools, right? They were doing pint containers for schools are now, or half pint containers for schools. I guess they went out and found their old jug processing equipment because they seem to be able to, they've pivoted fairly well. And so I would say that, even though we have we have cheese prices rising, it's really not likely that milk's going to disappear from the shelves again during this pandemic. I think you can rest assured of that.
Personally makes me happy because I'm a milk fan. So, so we're also hearing that consumers are turning to local farms for meat and vegetables and other produce. Is that the solution to the supply chain problem?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I've been getting that because a number of people have asked me to talk about this since this article in the conversation. And we've made it very clear what Jonathan has been saying, that the problem with the meat supply chain starts with the economic concentration of the meat industry. There's no way that we can have a healthy meat industry where 80% of our meat is provided by 4 companies. I mean, this is an antitrust problem. This and this kind of concentration in the industry provides the industry the amount of market power that enables them to sort of call the shots. And this is not good either for the health of workers or for the health of anyone, really. So we argue that basically the Justice Department should be doing its job, and that we need to start with at this level, and the ways in which these meat companies are part of global supply chains has been in the news quite recently. In fact, today in the New York Times, in terms of the meat, the companies that were told to stay open because of homeland security issues, which sound like they might be food security issues for the United States, have been a lot of that meat has been, or at least a good proportion of that meat has been going overseas. So they're part of a global supply system that is not necessarily good for our own food security. So we do need an economic policy change at the top. But we also need policy change. And this is one of the things that we have been talking about a lot, is that there are ways to change policy that will enable smaller regional companies to survive, to have a more, a more regionally based food system, and in particular, a more regionally based meat and dairy system. And in particular, they've been focused, the Congress has actually put together two pieces of legislation that are very interesting and very important. And if you're in favor of these pieces of legislation, I suggest you write to your senator and tell them to support him or her to support these. The first one is called the Prime Act, and that is because one of the problems people are having, Jonathan's going to talk a little bit about what's going on in terms of the local food supply. Literally, it's impossible to find, all of the local meat suppliers are completely sold out in terms of whether it's subscription or CSAs or meat CSAs and so on. It's impossible for local, there are these local, they're mobile slaughterhouses that go around and they slaughter cows or various kinds of animals for farmers to eat themselves. They can't sell any of that meat legally. Okay, so the Prime Act is a new piece of legislation that is enabling that would enable farmers to sell meat locally, which is almost impossible. There's the slaughterhouses, the local slaughterhouses have basically all closed except for these most of them, except for these local. Except for these mobile slaughterhouses. The second one, which I think is also very important, is called the Farm System Reform Act. And it's kind of ironic because the senator who is most involved in this is a vegan, that is Cory Booker. And he's the one who's been working with the meat industry. He's very interested in having a more humane meat sector as well in terms of slaughterhouses. But he has put together a piece of legislation that would basically break up the large meat industry, and particularly get rid of the sort of large combined animal feeding operations, also known as CAFOs, and so on. So, but remember that no matter what, slaughterhouses are wet and moist places, and and they have people in them. And so, there are regional slaughterhouses, but they have had some problems with COVID as well. So, so that's so we've been arguing that one, we need to have more regional production. We need to have more regional processing. We need to have changes in the laws. But we also, and Jonathan will talk more about, we also need consumers to be aware of these issues and be, and to support a more regional system. And that's one of the things that Jonathan will talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, and so just to expand on, why is it so hard to have local and regional processing for meat, for example? I'm not going to talk totally about meat or just about meat, but so generally, why can't you buy meat from the local farm just the way you can buy vegetables, fresh produce? Well, generally, any processing meat, slaughter, cutting up carcasses, etc., with some exceptions, that has to be done at a USDA licensed facility, and that means you actually have USDA inspectors there every hour the facility is open and operating. So you can't do that on a very small scale. It's a very big scale. And the regulation that goes into this is kind of vast and complex, and for good reason. People want, food safety is important. You're buying meat, you want it to be safe as possible. But I think it's fair to say that the regulatory system works fairly well and kind of contemplates it being done on a large scale. It doesn't really contemplate it being done on a small scale as much. There's some exceptions. For poultry, there's some exemptions for very small scale, depending on where you sell it. There's I won't get into too many details, but different levels of exemptions depending on, is this just for direct sales to consumers, or is it just for direct sales to retail stores? But generally, if you're producing in a large quantity, if you're selling to wholesale markets, you can't rely on any of these exemptions. You're going to need to do it through USDA licensed facility, and for beef and pork, no matter what, you have to do it through USDA licensed facility. Only exception for that is if you're slaughtering for yourself or your family, or what's called custom slaughter, and that's actually if you find any opportunities for custom slaughter, that could be a thing of interest right now. If you ever hear of freezer meat or meat shares, that's the opportunity to kind of buy like an 1/8 of a cow or 1/10 of a cow. Usually farmers set it up with spreadsheets, and technically the customers own a portion of the cow before it's slaughtered. And if you own a portion of the cow, it's your cow, and the farmer can slaughter it for you, and that doesn't need to be at a USDA licensed facility. By the way, I see Nick Cephas here, one of our former clinic students who's now working at Ag and Markets, who did a lot of research for me on slaughter regulations and custom slaughter. So Nick, jump in if I got any of that wrong. But anyways, long story short, there's a huge regulatory burden. It's hard to, it's hard to be a small scale meat processor. There certainly are some, but right now, for those that are out there, there's this huge demand. They're incredibly backed up. I was reading about one that said they have 2 years of back orders. So, for farmers that want to get their livestock slaughtered there, they have to wait 2 years. So that's not really workable. And so what does it take to scale that up to have that kind of local system that works? Well, on the one hand, it's the consumers. You want demand for that, but that demand is there. On the other hand, you kind of need infrastructure and regulations that make it work. And right now, the infrastructure and regulations, don't really incentivize it in the right way. There's a lot of support coming from the federal government for these big, the big four, keeping them open, supporting them. There's not as much support for how do we figure out ways to support the smaller players. And I think there really needs to be more of that to set up an infrastructure that can actually meet the demand for that local processing. I'd also just add, in terms of buying food locally generally, not just meat, not just dairy. Like Melanie said, now it's there's been huge demand for it, more demand than ever. It's hard now to sign up for a CSA, a community supported agriculture share. There may be some out there, but most of them are booked because there's just this immense demand, which is a good thing. So what can you do? Well, one, if people are interested in doing this, keep trying to find these opportunities. But two, I think it's important to stress that this is not just like a problem now. It's not just like, well, COVID is an issue and who knows how long it'll be an issue. We should shop locally. We should buy our food locally. And then when it's over, we're going to move back to the way things were before. I think this is just an example of why we should be shifting that direction. We already were shifting this direction. And I think a lot of people are identifying this as like a major leap forward. Like this is an opportunity to make this leap towards that direction. And hopefully it's a lasting one because there are lots of reasons why we want to support more local and regional food systems. And it's not just because of these issues that in disruption in the larger chains that we're seeing right now. If we care about how workers are treated, which I'll talk about, we should care about where we buy our food. If we care about environmental degradation and, are we buying food from a farm that uses regenerative practices that capture carbon and fight climate change, or are we buying food from farms that are operating on an industrial scale where they degrade soil and contribute to climate change? Like these kinds of factors, and there's many more considerations that go into this. Like these are factors that existed before, they will exist again. These are reasons why we should be thinking of shifting towards a more regional and local system. And I think this has just kind of shown a light on it, why that's valuable, but also why it's challenging. So you're going for a while about that, but I want to make that point that, when we talk about, is this a reason to shift to local? Like, yes, but it's not the only reason, and it's really shedding a light on it. And in a way, it could be a really good opportunity because more people are becoming aware of these connections and local chains than they were previously.
And for those of us, like Jonathan and I, who have been advocates of relocalizing food systems, this is this pivot is obviously very interesting to us and makes us feel somewhat hopeful. But we always get the question when we're asked about relocalizing the food system. The reason why large-scale industrial meat processors can outcompete local processors is because they can provide meat more cheaply, and so we're in a system now that provides us with this cheap food that now that we now have the crisis makes us think that maybe this is not the way to go. But then we also have the situation that people can't afford to pay more for their food. And so, those of us who can possibly pay, when I just went and looked at beef prices and grass-fed from one of these local purveyors is about twice as much. And it's even more if it's organic. So, for those people who think it's important, as part of their food security to put meat on the table, this is a problem. And when people ask us about that, one of the things that I always say is that we should have a system we should have an economy where people can afford to eat healthily. And that means that people need to be making a living that enables them to eat healthily. And that for the last 100 years, rather than giving people adequate compensation, what they've done is try to make the things that people need to buy cheaper. And at this point, we're finding that there's a crisis in terms of that kind of economic structure. That crisis, we see it right now, as Jonathan's going to talk about, in terms of a meat system that requires people to be ill in order to provide us that food.
Actually leads us to our next question, which is, how have the workers in our food supply chain been affected by the pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, something we touched on a little bit already, and something that's been very highly publicized. I think kind of surprising how highly publicized it's been, which is a good thing. People aware of this, is what's happening to workers in meatpacking facilities. And again, we're talking about very large facilities, most of them owned by the same big four companies here. So what's happened? So, starting in March, there were a lot of documented outbreaks of COVID in these large facilities. That grew in April. In April, you started to have some closures. And then in April, you also had the Trump administration, very publicly pressuring them to reopen, Trump issuing a executive order, which is a really interesting thing, not to go on too much of a tangent, but this executive order was kind of touted to be an order to open, and I'm going to take care of the liability issue, and don't worry about liability for anyone who gets sick or dies in these plants. In reality, it didn't do anything about the liability issue, but maybe it doesn't even matter. Maybe what was more important was just that kind of aggressive messaging that we are ordering you to reopen. And I think it was fairly effective that plants did reopen, and I think illustrated a pretty clear disregard for the health and safety of the workers. It was ignoring that issue as a human issue and just saying, well, we got to keep them open. And again, in retrospect, while they were saying they needed to be open for reasons of national security and food security, we have all these exports. So going back to the workers, why did this happen? Melanie's touched on it. These are moist, wet, cold environments where people are packed in very tightly, kind of by design. I mean, the whole economic model of this production is cheap labor, very fast lines. So people are packed tightly together on these lines, and they work very quickly together. Just kind of a natural incubator for this to spread. So what's happened since then? So CDC has released some guidelines, but they're fairly unclear. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they are in theory, the regulators monitoring safety conditions for workers, including at meatpacking plants. Almost all of their regulation on this and work on this has been guidance. Interestingly, they haven't issued any citations, and not just talking about meatpacking or food. They've issued one citation relating to COVID-related health exposure in all of America for any kind of industry. It was at a nursing home recently. But if that's the regulator that is there for enforcement, they're not doing a whole lot of enforcement. I think there's many reasons for that. They're probably severely understaffed and don't really have the capability to fully do this at this point. But it's not like the problem has been solved. So plants closed, plants reopened. There are still outbreaks. Those outbreaks are still spreading. And while there have been some measures, the production lines are somewhat slower now, and there's some spacing out and precautionary measures have been taken. I think many would say they're not nearly enough. I'm going to show one thing if I can share my screen. So the one slide I have, just want to show one picture. This is I think this is a Smithfield plant or a Dyson plant, I forget, one of the large meatpacking plants. And this is an image of the precautionary measures they put in place, these plastic barriers, plexiglass. Based on what we know about COVID being spread, I mean, that doesn't do a whole lot to have like a 1 or 2 feet wide plexiglass thing between people who are still incredibly close together. Air circulates. These are like air conditioned cold environments where people are on the line all day long next to each other. That's not going to do a whole lot. Now they are wearing masks in this picture, but those masks were actually introduced fairly late in the game in these large meatpacking plants. So there's some measures, but this is still a real issue in terms of outbreaks in meatpacking plants. And of course, it's not just meatpacking plants. you're starting to hear a lot more. It hasn't been as publicized about farm workers. And not surprisingly, as we move into the farming season in the last couple of months, you're seeing it there more now. There have been outbreaks all over. One I was just reading about in Immokalee, Florida. It's kind of the center of the tomato growing region in Florida, which is source of a lot of the tomatoes in the country. Actually, there's a long history of farm workers in Immokalee, tomato growers, doing a lot of great organizing for farm workers' rights. And they've gotten a lot of gains in the last 20 years, and they've gotten a lot of concessions from some large chains like Taco Bell and others to price in some benefits or it's a couple cents for when they buy tomato in bulk, that these are going towards certain things that are worked into contracts with farms, that the workers are treated a certain way. Not going to go into too much detail on that, but they've been hit incredibly hard now. Saw something saying that it's possible that the infection rate in farm workers in that area of Florida is easily one of the highest in the country, if not one of the highest infection rates in the world right now. And many of these are migrant workers. They move throughout the country with the season. So the season in Florida is ending, or maybe has already ended, and people move up north or Midwest. And why is this happening in these places? Well, similar reasons: people working in very poor conditions, working close together. Particularly, farm housing is kind of notoriously terrible conditions with people together, and part of it is the labor practices and employment practices. So for meatpacking plants, there are very strict rules about absences, and there's kind of a carrot and stick approach that if people have perfect attendance, they sometimes get like a steak as a reward or a cash bonus as a reward, but you need perfect attendance. You can't be off the line for 5 minutes in a week. So people who might be sick, they're incentivized to not do that. Now for farm workers are actually exempt from many of the most important federal protections we have for laborers. So on a federal level, protections we have for minimum wage, paid sick leave, overtime pay, the right to organize, those farm workers do not apply. State by state, it's a patchwork, and New York actually very recently changed its labor laws to add most of these protections for farm workers. But for a farm worker in Florida, whereas every other kind of worker would have paid sick leave, if they're not feeling well, they don't have paid sick leave. They can't afford to take time off. So kind of combine poor labor laws with poor labor conditions, and it's kind of a recipe for disaster. And so this is, I'm sure, going to be more publicized in months to come as one of the major sources of outbreaks. I think Governor DeSantis in Florida has already said that's the number one source of outbreak in Florida right now.
And we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do about this, but one of the things we've been talking about quite a bit is what should the government do about this? And one of the things that's become quite clear is that the protections that could be carried out in these situations are not being carried out. So even while the administration, the Trump administration, has said that these companies need to open and that workers need to go back to work, they have not, as Jonathan's saying, they have not required any, they haven't required even for people, for these attendance rewards to be ended. These attendance rewards are still in place, and people then feel like even though they feel sick, they feel like they need to go in order to get a bonus of, whether it's a steak or money. And so, there's those rules. And then it turns out that a number of USDA inspectors have gotten sick, and some have actually died. And a lot of USDA inspectors are not coming in at the moment. And then, the Trump administration has seriously defunded OSHA, and a lot of the OSHA positions are not. So I mean, having the government do the right thing would make a difference in this, and making sure that the government does the right thing is an important aspect of this. But Jonathan's going to talk a little bit about what we can do as consumers as well.
Do you want to touch on first some new ideas that are coming out of this crisis and how the Food and Beverage Law Clinic at HALB is helping farmers pivot to this new system or a new system?
Sure. So, I mean, first, I just want to talk a little bit about what is going on right now with farms in our region. So, I could, to be honest, most of what I can speak to is fairly anecdotal. We work with small farms in New York State, and we don't work really with restaurants. We work with some other food businesses or processors. So I'm going to speak mostly to what I know. So first of all, like what is going on with farms in our region, small farms in our region, and I think this is similar to what's going on with small farms in other parts of the country. It's a pretty complex picture. You may have heard a lot about like demand for farmers markets and CSA and other opportunities to buy directly from farms has skyrocketed. So you might think like, okay, some of these farms are doing great, right? And it's kind of, but kind of not. So you can separate it into categories of, there are the small farms in our region, which is many of the small farms in the Hudson Valley that already sell primarily to consumers. So they're in the best position, right? Like they don't have institutional customers and restaurant customers that they've lost. They already sell to consumers, so they're ready to go with this. Then you also have a lot of farms that sell both to consumers directly and sell to institutional clients, sell to restaurants, et cetera. And then you have some that sell entirely to wholesale markets or to institutional clients and restaurants. So a lot of the firms that we work with, many do both, and they've had to completely pivot what they're doing. They're like, well, half my customers are gone. They evaporated because they're restaurants and they don't exist anymore. So I have to completely pivot what I'm doing, find new ways to deliver to my customers directly to consumers. And many of the farms we work with, already market directly to consumers, but they've had to shift a lot of what they're doing. They're already facing challenges because, well, I can't really deliver in the same way. There's all these logistical challenges. A lot of my workers aren't showing up for various reasons. They have to take care of the kids. They're sick. They're worried about exposure. So I'd say even for the ones that are in the best position, the good news is that some are in this good position, that there is this demand for local food. But from everyone I've talked to, even for those farms that are in the very best position, it's a huge challenge. It's a challenge, and they're kind of just breaking even or doing where they were last year, because even though there's all this demand, they can't immediately create that much more product. They plan and have to plan far ahead of time. And there's all sorts of new challenges in how they market that food, how they deliver that food, and everyone's doing an amazing job of thinking on the fly and thinking creatively. And then there's a whole other side of the businesses that have been hurt very, very much that aren't able to easily pivot to these markets. And there's many farms where that's the case that can't easily pivot. Dairy farms in particular in this region, much of the Northeast, as well as much of the country, have been facing a really tough economic condition for years. And a month ago or so, a group in the Catskills that works with dairy farmers there told me that what everyone's telling them is that it's been hard, it's been incredibly hard, and now this is the straw that's going to break the camel's back. We don't know how we're going to do it anymore. Like again, this is an incredibly dynamic situation, as Melanie has talked about with milk, and it's changing all the time. So maybe they're saying something different this month than they were saying last month, but it's been incredibly hard for a lot of farms. So going back to what the clinic's doing, we're trying to do what we can to provide support, and we do that through legal support. Some of that, again, is helping people try to access sources of funds, and maybe the more exciting, hopeful part of it is trying to help people open up to new markets and do new things. So some of what we're seeing in terms of new models and trying to help people with new models is more models for intermediaries and food hubs. So food hubs are, basically, very simply speaking, connecting producers with consumers. And these are things that have existed before, but people are, creating new, innovative ways to do this, more ways to do this. There's a lot of online sales platforms that are cropping up with how people can connect consumers with producers. We're working with some organizations that are doing that, some organizations that are doing the mutual aid projects where they might work in specific neighborhoods of New York City, and they're creating mutual aid projects where they can buy food in bulk and share it with their neighbors. We're working with a kind of online sales portal version of a farmer's market where it works just like a farmer's market, and people order ahead of time on an online sales platform. And then this group delivers by van, door to door. And there's many projects just like that are cropping up. It's exciting because, again, even if we move past this pandemic, there's a lot of good reasons to do business this way and access these local chains anyways. And there's a lot of challenges legally that we deal with, because anytime you're doing something new and kind of different, it's more complicated. And New York State Department of Ag and Markets has been really great. We've been talking to them, but there's a lot of just new stuff happening where they're working on the fly in terms of what it means for permitting and licensing when someone's doing a new mode of connection and delivery and accessing markets that people haven't done before. It doesn't necessarily fit into the regulatory system we already have it set up. So I'll go on for a while, but I think that's kind of a quick picture of the kind of work we're doing. Generally, just trying to support new infrastructure for how people can access their food in this pandemic.
And it's been interesting how there's this one technology that if it did not exist, could not have enabled local farmers to pivot, and that's Square and Square type technologies. Because I know a number of different farms that once they realized what was going to happen in terms of having customers, having to socially distance, having to do, rather than having people come to the farm to have to do orders and pickup, it fairly quickly pivoted to an online ordering system because the technology is there. And so, what Jonathan and the food clinic are doing is helping with the legal aspects of that. But it's interesting that there are technological aspects that have actually made it somewhat easier to pivot as well. So it looks like we have some time for questions.
I actually have two in the chat box from Catherine. Are employment unions also failing these workers? And are the Prime Act and the Farm System Act the only protections available for the workers?
I'm looking in the chat. Can you say those again, Michelle?
Sure. Are employment unions also failing these workers? And are the Prime Act and the Farm System Act the only protections available for the workers?
Well, I don't, neither of those acts are actually protecting workers. The Prime Act is enabling local farmers to be able to slaughter and sell. These are proposed pieces of legislation. So go right to your senator and support them. But so the Prime Act is about farmers being able to sell, and the other act is about basically eventually shutting down these large confined animal feeding operations, which, for those of you who have seen anything about how those kinds of systems work, that they are both but hard on workers, hard on the farmers who have to run these, and also hard on the animals themselves. So none of this has to do with workers. And remember that in the food industry, I don't know what the percentages are in terms of slaughterhouses. Maybe Jonathan knows that. I do know that for farm workers in general, nearly about half of them are undocumented. And of course, undocumented workers do not have protections. And there was an era, an earlier era, when, right after, if Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? There was an era in which slaughterhouse workers were unionized. They no longer are. They moved away from Chicago and places where they had unionized workers into greenfield areas where they did not have union representation. So what kinds of protections these workers have? Fairly minimal.
Yeah, and go just that really well. I mean, going back to OSHA, OSHA in theory is the regulatory body that regulates occupational safety. This is exactly what we're talking about: safety when you're on the job. And again, they haven't done a whole lot. I'm not saying it's easy for them to do it. I'm sure it's not easy, but to me, it raises an eyebrow that, again, for all of America, for every industry, there's been one citation issued by OSHA for issues relating to COVID safety on the job. And certainly none in the context of farm workers or meatpacking plant workers.
And Catherine actually had an accompanying question asking if there are any new systems or ideas that would address the labor issues within the meat industry.
What I'm hearing is that people are more interested in organizing, union organizing in these areas now. But it's whether or not that's going to be successful. It's very hard to organize undocumented workers in particular. So we not that I've seen. Jonathan, have you seen anything in terms of worker protection? I mean, honestly, having an OSHA that actually works, I teach environmental policy, and I often, for many years, I taught environmental policy as gridlock, right? Like nobody can get along, and no new laws can happen, and we need these new laws to meet our new challenges. Now, this year, I talked about environmental policy as rollbacks, right? Deregulating, fewer protections, the regulating agencies as being defunded and therefore no longer capable of meeting their mission. This is the problem right now. And so we need it. We need a government that works in order to have protection and so on.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree. Certainly we need a government that works. That's the number one thing. In terms of grassroots kind of efforts that can work, one thing that comes to mind, again, that I mentioned briefly, is a good example is the Immokalee workers of Florida. One of the best case studies of farm worker organizing that actually was incredibly effective, and it was kind of like a public shaming campaign against places like Taco Bell, and there have been like several prosecutions and convictions in Florida in the 90s were like actual slavery on farms, like people held against their will and forced labor, and kind of public shaming campaign of, well, the tomatoes that go in your tacos, and not just Taco Bell, but they're the ones that come to mind at the moment. This is coming from slave labor, and it eventually worked. And there's all sorts of chains and large buyers have signed these contracts that basically guarantee they're going to ensure that a few extra cents are paid to ensure there's certain worker protections for the workers that are growing those tomatoes. So that kind of campaign, that kind of grassroots organizing has worked. New York State recently changed its labor laws for farm workers, and that as well, you could look to change in the makeup of New York State government. You could also look to like a long history of grassroots organizing around that issue.
Yes, decades and decades of grassroots organizing in New York to get to the point where we have more worker protections for farm workers in New York. I see a couple of questions in the chat. Michelle, should we talk about one? There's one from Luis.
Yeah, Luis is actually joining us from Miami.
Oh my goodness.
So, yeah, so his situation might be a little bit different than like New York availability. I just want to let you know that. I know Luis. So, but it's a great question, I think, for urban dwellers.
Right. And I think that John, one of the things that's interesting is Jonathan's work with on the food hubs, and because a lot of that is coming out of, as he has been talking about it, coming out of mutual aid in urban areas, which is even more, are we going to be able to grow our own food in our city apartments? Probably not, but can you get together with people in your community to have food buying clubs and mutual aid clubs where people, and this is what people are doing in New York right now, not just for food, but for all the other needs that people have. And so these sort of more sharing communities is a new idea that seems to be coming up from the ground level, and making it, and of course you need the kind of environment that'll enable those communities to work. But those are the sorts of things that I think the Food Law Clinic is also helping those kinds of, grassroots organizations be able to do what they want to do. Yeah,
thanks, Melanie. And I'm a big fan and supporter of urban agriculture. Like Melanie said, I don't think it's possible for the residents of New York City to feed themselves by growing within New York City. There's just a lot of logistical challenges. I mean, it's a little more around the margins of how much you can grow within a city. And there are rural landscapes that are very close to every city with productive soil where you really can grow a lot more in a totally different scale. I think that's still essential. I don't think we're going to get to. I don't think we're able to scale up to a level where that many people are self-sufficiently growing for themselves within urban environments. I think it's important to have urban farming, but I think a lot of it is going to have to come from rural areas. But like Melanie said, it's all about, well, how do we get that food from rural areas to urban environments? How much are we paying for it? Who has access? What kind of access do we have? That's what it all comes down to. Yeah.
I'd like Nicholas has asked two different questions that are interrelated about, and anybody, and I suspect that Nicholas knows something about agroecology because he's asking about sort of the relationship between animal and vegetable operations, and agroecology tries to work within a sort of a nutrient cycle in which animals are part of the cycle, right? Because they provide this is particularly true for organic agriculture, where they provide the fertilizer as opposed to externals, artificial fertilizers, and so on. So these are all very important ways in which you know, a more agroecological farming operation can happen. Can the law encourage this kind of integration? Well, unfortunately, because of food safety issues, including the whole, you know, particularly, and as someone who used to teach and research in California, there was a lot of work that showed that was looking at, you know, remember when all those spinach, bags of spinach had E. coli, HN7, I can never remember the number. Anyway, that there was that sort of a toxic E. coli. And people were, and one of the things that came out of this was a greater disconnect between vegetable operations and livestock, because obviously livestock can be, it's tough to sort of manage the enteric system of an animal. So so it does. So there is an amount of discouragement. There's so much discouragement in terms of how you come up with not just in terms of the law, but in terms of the economy, in terms of how do you come up with an operation? Because efficiency is all about monoculture, right? And so how do you come up with a diversified farm operation that actually enables a farmer to make a living economically, and you know, a more integrated farm operation would include fruits, vegetables, and animals, and that's a challenge that folks are still are struggling with ever since the decline of those kinds of farms that were you know, pretty widespread during, say, the 1930s and 40s until you know, until the artificial fertilizers came on the scene. You kind of needed animals in your operation in order to provide yourself with fertilizer. So so these are, you know, in some cases, technology is working for a more integrated system, a more just and local system and sharing system, and sometimes technologies are not. So those are the, what do you think, Jonathan? How are there laws that help farmers have this more integrated system?
Not that I can think of. I think you covered it well. I would just add, and I think Nick, for knowing Nick, I think he knows this, but you know, the siloing, you know, because of these risks, trying to separate animal operations from produce operations, it doesn't mean you don't have things like, you see these images of like massive CAFOs with thousands and thousands of animals, and then like a tiny little canal, and over here is, you know, hundreds of acres of spinach and salad greens being grown by another operation. It's horrifying, but that still is where these outbreaks come from. These outbreaks and romaine lettuce and all that, it comes from the runoff and spraying sometimes of the waste from these large animal operations. So I would think that a system where you know, one operation can integrate things together in a safe way is a lot better than a system where everything's siloed into massive CAFOs and massive vegetable operations that run off into each other.
Right, but the most recent laws have not encouraged that. Have basically said we just have to keep these two kinds of operations apart. So you know one person who's Nick, and I know Chris, who's actually asked a question, and Chris is the director of the nutrition program at CHP at PACE, and she's asking about the workers being protected who are working on the school districts and school meals. Jonathan, do you know anything about worker protections in those situations? Have you been working on any of those projects?
I haven't been working on that, so I'm not sure I know how to answer this in particular. Chris, do you mean in terms of like, how are they being protected from getting sick, or protected in terms of the liability that could come up for everything they're doing? They're putting themselves into risky situations.
I'm just thinking about them as kind of the unsung heroes out there, doling out these, these meals to students, and they're coming up with these creative ways to get them to students in a sanitary, bulk way. And then I'm also thinking about how school districts have such a limited budget to put together, healthful meals. And so the quality of, what they can put together is really limited. And now they have to really stretch their budget to include transportation costs and things that they got a very small chunk of the funding that, has been given to kind of bridge that gap. So I'm thinking about how the problems in the food chain, have affected them too, in terms of what's being produced and then what school districts can acquire and what they can afford and then produce. It's more like just sort of something to put out there. I don't know if anybody has the answer yet, but.
Well, a number of people have looked in particular at what Michelle Obama tried to do in terms of school food, and how much of a struggle that was. And of course, even what she managed to do has been rolled back. So, and that was even before the pandemic. So I think it's really an interesting question as to what's, how, who's working on these sort of local free food systems that are around right now. And I don't think there's been I haven't seen a lot of journalist articles on it even.
No.
My connection to this is kind of pre-COVID, but our clinic has done some work on supporting farm to school sales, and it's something that's picked up a lot of traction around the country recently. And like just in the last year or so, New York really changed its policy in terms of the amount of state funding that funds school lunches in New York State public schools. I think it went from like 5 cents to 25 cents from the state if they're sourcing a certain amount of their food from New York State producers, which is great. Where we kind of get involved is more like on the ground level, working with the really small farms that like want to work with their local school district, and the local school district wants to work with them. It's still really challenging because even if you source from New York, like you're probably sourcing from just the biggest vendor in New York, and sometimes it's not even necessarily grown in New York. It's kind of like processed in New York, and so it's the whole idea of scaling up farm to school. I think is something people are really excited about, but it's like easier said than done. Even with some of the state incentives and money going towards it, like the real challenge is like, well, how do we make sure like we're actually buying locally and not just like, buying again from wholesalers? And that seems to be kind of what's still going on. So it's an exciting opportunity and something like I think people are still working on ways to make it work. I think this kind of sheds light on like why it's so important.
So there's a question, because we're running out of time, so I want to make sure that Catherine Sierra's question gets answered as well. And I know that, Jonathan and I sort of talked about, who's going to talk about what we can do, and we decided Jonathan was going to talk about it. So maybe we could finish with that.
Well, I know Catherine's taking the clinic in the fall, so that's one thing.
Okay.
Yeah, one thing, just very quickly, like, as a consumer supporting local food systems, sometimes easier said than done, because like we've said right now, like a lot of these things are sold out, CSAs are sold out. I'm gonna try to send something in the chat if I can. This is something that Grow NYC, the nonprofit that runs most of the New York City farmers markets, put together. It's a spreadsheet of farms in our area that have different opportunities for buying directly, whether it's like you can pre-order or pick up at a farmer's market, or they can deliver door to door or something else. But that's just one part of it. I think the term like Michael Pollan coined of like vote with your fork, like we can change the world if consumers change their eating decisions. There's some truth to that, but I think a lot of people in the food policy world kind of say, well, that's really disguising that so many of these problems can't just be solved by consumers making decisions. There's so many other sides to it. So I think it's important to note that like you want to vote with your fork, you want to support local food systems, you want to buy from places that are treating their workers well, but there are political aspects of this as well. Like we can't really have these strong local food systems that treat workers the right way if we don't have the right political, legal infrastructure to support that. And the laws that have been proposed that Melanie mentioned, I think are a good example of that. It's like it's not enough just to have demand for the right kind of thing. You have to actually support it. You have to have the government do the right thing. So I think thinking of it as a political issue and getting more political awareness of it, and so that people can vote with their votes and not just with their forks, I think that's an important piece of it. And then how else to?
That, yeah, but just to add to that, part of there's a group of basically colleagues of mine that are working on the agricultural aspects of the Green New Deal, and so the Green New Deal for agriculture is another thing that sort of takes in all of these other things that you can support the Green New Deal and support a lot of these more local, that would be things that would support these more local projects as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nick has a good comment in the comment box: advocate for join community gardens. And the last thing I have to say, we haven't really talked at all about food security issues, but we could spend another hour talking about that. I mean, it's a very scary thing right now. Children and families and people going hungry, and the risks that we're facing right now, and already the numbers are way more than they previously were, and food banks are, I think, under a lot of pressure. So supporting food banks, volunteering at food banks, that's another thought. And again, another thing we could talk about is food security, which is a scary thing for sure.
Yes, particularly as food prices go up, and then people can't afford food at all because they don't have jobs.
Oh, so much for talking to us, and all of you for attending. It's a great discussion. I personally think it's a really important topic, so I appreciate all of you taking the time to be part of this. And I hope we have some better days ahead and some good answers for these things that you're addressing. Okay.
Great, thank you for having us.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you, Michelle. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Everyone be well.
Everyone.